And what we pointed out was natural history museums lie by omission.
This is the Museum of Truth and Lies. Welcome to the Imperial Loot Gallery with me, Yasmin Khan. In this episode, I explore legacies of empire in museums by talking to Subhadra Das.
My name is Subhadra Das. I am a writer and a historian, and I tell stories about science and society.
What's your personal relationship to truth?
Okay, this is a very interesting question. Because it's like I'm not a politician, so it doesn't sound dubious. I'm a historian, which I think means that I probably have a slightly greater appreciation for how truth is constructed in our society. And without wanting to be too depressing, the things that are true are the ways in which we make them. So I think my relationship with the truth is as optimistic as possible.
So you're hopeful?
I am hopeful. You have to be. It sounds like a very tired hopefulness. I can appreciate that. But otherwise, yeah, it's very difficult to motivate yourself to do anything if you feel like things aren't going to change.
So you see yourself as a champion of the truth?
Again, that's like a very knight in shining armour type scenario. Champion? Well,
or
yeah.
An advocate?
An advocate for? No, I mean a searcher for, I think, right? And also, yeah, a constructor of, as we all do. Yeah, you know what? We are all constructors of truth.
I wanted to know what inspired the title of Subhadra's new book, Uncivilised, 10 Lies That Made the West.
This book is actually a history of archaeology and anthropology and all of those different ideas that go into constructing how we see each other and how we view our own humanity. And really, yeah, how much this idea of the West being advanced, being a place of progress and civilization really isn't true. And that's how we ended up with 10 lies. I'm going to level with you. It was difficult to get to that point.
Have you had any backlash from the scientific community?
No, but primarily because I don't think they've read it. I think a lot of scientists are probably actually a lot more familiar with this history than we give them credit for. My general frustration is that not enough of them acknowledge it and acknowledge the way that it frames their current work in ways that are unhelpful. But they'd also be justified in saying this is not a great time to come for science because there's enough people, climate change deniers, that's the main one, really. But yeah, to me, the thing that I'm having a go at isn't science so much in and of itself, although I do talk about how science was the way in which race was created and constructed as an idea. I'm not having a go at that so much as the idea of what's called scientism, the idea that scientific approaches, or certainly the things that are defined in the West as scientific approaches, are the only ways toward the truth, are the only ways to go about knowing what the world is and what other people are within it. That is a very limited view. That is a very narrow view and a really, really dangerous and unhelpful one, because what it does is it alienates people. It suggests that people who are religious don't have anything to contribute to the world, which in my experience of religious people, very much the opposite. A lot of religious people are hugely compassionate for their fellow human beings in ways that we can all learn from. Science has a dispassion built into it that I think is not helpful. And it was very clear that that was how eugenics.
Well, Western science.
Western science, definitely. This is it. That would be the thing that would get backlash, is the idea that Western science is even a thing. That is what I usually get. It's like, no, science is everyone. Everyone can do science. Everything is science. It's like, well, if everyone can do it, look at the publication rates and look at who is producing the papers and the journals and the knowledge and look at the imbalance as to how that exists in the world.
So what surprised you most in your research process?
Probably the thing that was most surprising there is just how much there was. It was really...
How many lies?
How many lies?
Or how much stuff to look at?
No, it's like how easy it was to find the stories. That bit wasn't difficult. The trick of it was, having found all of these stories, was like trying to work out where they fit and how they worked best. So, for example, in the story, in the chapter that's all about justice, which is entitled Justice is Blind, I tell the story of the Trail of Tears, the genocide of the Cherokee people, along with 4 other groups of people who were called the 5 civilized tribes. And when I first heard that story, that there were groups of Native American people who were called civilized, I knew that that had to be in there immediately. But they originally started out, I started telling that story in the chapter about writing, because the Cherokee were the first Native American group of people to develop their own system of writing from scratch. They had their own newspaper. They had their own written constitution. So that story started out in one chapter, but it ended up in another.
Tell me about your interest in the history of eugenics and why is it still relevant to our lives today?
I ended up as curator of a thing called the Galton Collection at University College London. The Galton Collection is named for a guy called Sir Francis Galton, who is the British Victorian scientist who coined the term eugenics. I don't know if many of your listeners are even familiar with the idea that eugenics is a British invention, let alone actually what eugenics is. I think if people have heard of it, the story sort of starts and stops with the Nazis. And actually, the story of eugenics is bigger than we think it is. It's much wider and more encompassing of other parts of the world and other horrors enacted in its name. And the other thing that I say about eugenics is it never went away. This is a very troubling and troublesome history. And as someone with an interest in moving towards greater social justice, which I'll put to you is also another aspect of building truth together, being critical of the eugenic thinking in our society is a fundamental way in which I like to approach history in general, but also the way that our society is set up.
How do you personally reconcile your professional interest in a topic that can cause quite a lot of emotional labour researching that?
Do you know, I don't know whether I've done this for so long that I'm kind of dead inside, or whether it's because I never expected to do this. As a little girl, I did not dream of becoming a historian of eugenics. That wasn't part of the game plan. Museum curator, yes. Author, yes. Those were things I aspired to. But the subject matter, not so much. And so as a result, I think the thing that drives me primarily is probably more anger and dissatisfaction. In the early days, it was shocking and it was difficult to encounter these histories and to look at the way some people thought about how people like me are in very racist and very cruel ways. But once you wrap your head around the fact that that was an aspect of the reality, not just then but now, in a way I find it kind of more liberating. I always say, we're brought up with very particular messages. We're told there's no such thing as race, but there is such a thing as racism. And to me, the thing that I always found very difficult about that was, if there's no such thing as race, why are we talking about it in the first place? How did we come to constructing an idea of biological difference between people? How is racism a real thing? If race isn't real, how does racism become real? And when you look at the history of science, it's easier to fill in the gaps in that story. And so to me, that's more empowering and more vindicating in a way. The thing that's difficult is when you don't have the vocabulary to be able to voice those frustrations. And so for me, for the last 10, 15 years of having done this job and learning about these histories, it's just more empowering than it is anything else.
And that could be a whole subject for a new book. The construction of race is one of the biggest lies.
Well, chapter 1.
Oh, it's there. Of course. Yeah. Nullius in Verba.
Correct. Indeed. Yep, very good. I had to fight with my editor quite a bit. She's like, no one will understand what that means.
I did have to Google it.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I explained what it means in the thing. But yeah, simply the idea that we don't take anyone's word for what the truth is, when we are at the same time very much bound up in the truth of whose word counts and whose doesn't, just exposes a hypocrisy that exists. And I think that's definitely worth untangling. Plenty of other people have written about the history of the construction of race as an idea, which is one of the reasons it was very frustrating that I wasn't able to do it in a slightly longer form. But yeah, we'll see. Who knows? Early days.
Part 2, coming soon to a bookshop near you.
Indeed.
Right. So just to clarify, Nullius in Verba means take nobody's word for it?
Take nobody's word for it. It's the motto of the Royal Society, which is just a little bit further down the road from where we're recording this. So if you go to the Royal Society in Mayfair, you will see carved above the door this Latin phrase, take nobody's word for it. They were trying to use it in a positive way, which is like, do not... The word that they were talking about was the word of God. So what those early scientists were trying to say was, don't just because the ancient Greeks said a thing, don't believe them, go out and do experiments and decide for yourself what the real thing is there. So it comes from a good place in terms of skepticism, in terms of the joy of human endeavour and trying to work things out. But the way in which it was carried out did not live up to those high ideals.
Subhadra makes a compelling case that consciously or not, everyone's personal heritage informs their work practice. But are professionals from racialised groups more heavily scrutinised?
I was born to Indian parents in the Middle East, And I'm the product of a Western education. I went to an English school until I was 11 and an American high school until I was 18. I think a lot of what I did in the role as curator of the Galton collection was what happened when the university accidentally put a brown woman in charge of their race science collection. These were histories I had not encountered before. The things that I learned while doing that job are things I had to learn for myself. I am a person of colour. I'm a woman of colour who used to work in a predominantly white institution. It's easy enough to pretend like those things don't matter, particularly when it comes to science. There's this idea that science is somehow neutral, that these are things that scientists don't need to worry themselves with, or worst case scenario, which is often the way some geneticists talk about it, geneticists disprove the idea of race, so why do we keep going on about it? And I will remind you that it may be the case that there is no such thing as race, but racism is nonetheless a very real thing. I don't know how I would have done that job differently had I been a different person, but it's very clear that the way that I did it and the way that I approached it is informed by who I am. That, by the way, is true of everybody. It's just if you happen to be racialised as white, most people tend not to question your politics. And again, they should.
And as a truth seeker, what's the nub of your message you want people to remember the most?
Bearing in mind that the truth is what we make it, be very careful in who you listen to and who you choose to believe. I think so much of the mistake that we make because of ideas to do with civilization and who we consider to be civilized. We invest a huge amount of authority in one group of people, white people, ostensibly, that they are the ultimate authority in what knowledge is. What I wanted to get across in my book is not only is it the case that people who are not racialized as white have held Westerners to a much higher account for their idea of what civilization should be, but also these are people with world views, with different ways of being and acting in the world. First of all, that are so much kinder, but actually also that are so much safer and more useful in terms of how we think about the world and how we enact it. Again, there's so much Native American wisdom in terms of how to be on the planet in ways that involve stewardship rather than pure extraction that I think we could learn a lot from.
So be careful about who to believe. That segues really nicely into what that means for museums, like how much the public should trust what museums tell them. So in your view, what's the biggest lie that made museums in the West?
I think the biggest lie about museums is that they function as anything other than warehouses for loot, but also the idea that the view of the world that they present, this is particularly the case with science museums, for example, that the view of the world that they present is somehow neutral, objective, and true in and of itself. Again, truth is something we construct. So the idea that you can walk into a space like the Natural History Museum in London, for example, and be presented with a true view of the natural world is an extraordinarily naive way to think about it. If it's okay, I'm going to plug the work of a colleague of mine, Jack Ashby, who's written a book called Platypus Matters, which is all about Australian animals and how the ways in which they are depicted are strange, bizarre, unusual, are highly colonial. And a lot of the work that Jack has done actually is really good at sort of peeling away this artifice of the neutral, objective, scientific museum. So, for example, he's the co-author of a paper talking about how dioramas in natural history museums tend to replicate ideas to do with heteronormative couples. So if you go to the Natural History Museum in the US, for example, in New York City, there's a diorama of bears. There's 3 bears. And you're gonna guess what I'm going to say now. There's a papa bear, a mama bear, and a baby bear. And they do look like this, nuclear family type thing. You expect Papa Bear has just like put his hat away and come home for dinner and is wondering why the porridge has gone cold. But like if you saw in real life, that scenario ends up with Papa Bear killing Baby Bear. Even other things like bird displays, the female bird compared to the male bird is displayed in sort of more submissive poses, like in the background type thing. We impose our view of what we think is true on the natural world. And what museums do, and science museums again are included in this, is that they portray that world in ways that are really unhelpful.
So there's clearly a pattern of bias, power and patriarchy playing out in the museum displays. But
That's what I went to say. Yeah, exactly. Use that. That was very good. Yeah.
Do you think that museums are sometimes telling the truth, at least?
I think they try to. This again was like, again, tricky to work out what the title of the book should be. To start out with, I was very much like, maybe it should be 10 myths that made the West. But because it's like, sometimes these things are not so deliberate in how the lie comes across. They're definitely lies, by the way, because the definition of a lie is a thing that is not true. But I think people definitely are trying to put across certain aspects of truth. But this, again, this was the topic of a paper that I wrote with my colleague, Dr. Miranda Lowe, who is principal curator at the Natural History Museum. And what we pointed out was natural history museums lie by omission. So it may be that you can walk into the Natural History Museum, look up at the ceiling of the Hintze Hall. So look up past the enormous, beautiful whale skeleton, which is like so dramatic in that space. And you'll see tiles depicting different plants. And if you go up to the second level, you'll be able to find one that was named after a black man. His name was Graman Kwesi. And he was a medical man. He was a medical expert. And the plant was named after him because he used that plant to create a bitter tea that was used to treat digestive complaints. And in point of fact, extracts and synthetic versions of that plant are still used in modern medicine today. Where's that story? You know, it's there, but you'd have to know where to find that tile, and you'd have to know who that person was. So what we were trying to say was, it's not even so much hidden histories, which is an expression that I find mildly annoying. And what I will always say, if it's a hidden history, it means some fucker hid it, right? So again, there's that deliberateness in terms of that aspect of how these stories are told. But they're not hidden so much as just never told in the first place. And perhaps unsurprising, because if the history of race science tells you that black people are not scientists, that they don't have knowledge, that they don't do medicine or these sorts of things, it's not even a story worth telling then, is it? And that's the thing. That's where I start to get angry.
You say quite clearly that museums lie by omission and that museums are warehouses for loot.
Yes.
So there's two things. So I want to challenge that idea that everything in museums is loot.
Sure. Because
maybe there's non-loot
alongside
the loot, but also what does good truth-telling of objects look like, wherever it's from?
Yeah, absolutely. So no, it's definitely true that not every single thing in a museum is loot. Some of the things were killed to be put in there. And I know it's really important you say this, because it's definitely not the case that everything is stolen. But to me, the ways in which we can interpret these objects in more meaningful ways is to talk about how they got to be where they were. I'll give you an example of an exhibition that my colleagues at UCL and I curated at the Grant Museum of Zoology, which is the first time, as far as I'm aware, and I'm happy to be corrected, but it's the first time a natural history museum asked the question, where did all of these animals come from? And also, possibly more pertinently, why are they here?
How did it get here? Who took them and why?
Exactly. And once you start asking those questions about, the technical word is provenance, suddenly it's like, okay, well, there's a Bengal tiger, or there are antelope that were killed by officers in the British Army in the 1960s. And yeah, it's like, okay, well, where did that thylacine come from? Thylacine, Tasmanian tiger. And if we're talking about the thylacine and the way that it was deliberately hunted by British settlers in Tasmania because they were seen to be threatening to sheep farming in that neck of the woods, we should also really talk about how the same thing was done to native Tasmanians, how essentially they were hunted and a genocide was carried out against Tasmanian people in the same way as that animal was hunted as well, just in order to make more land for sheep grazing and for English settler colonialism. All of these stories are there. It's just a museum has to make a decision as to whether or not to tell them. And the point that Miranda and I were making was, just because these are science museums, it doesn't mean we should close our eyes to the historical context in which that science was being carried out.
You've given some pretty poignant examples of objects in museums that conceal the truth. Can you think about any examples of objects in museums that reveal the truth better, or well even?
Like sometimes it just hits you in the face and it's so obvious, but they're not very glamorous. In the Grant Museum, there's a specimen of something called a shipworm. And shipworm are like a woodworm, but with ships. So they like eating wood that's been soaked in seawater. And you can imagine that, the British Navy is built on ships, not just the British Navy, but also the East India ships and all of the various other water-going vessels. The point we made in that exhibition is that the British Empire is not just the bits on the map coloured pink, it's all the bits of blue in between as well. And the empire was maintained, and it was the workings of empire carried out by those water-going vessels going between the different continents. Shipworm was a really big problem. And so the fact that the shipworm is in this natural history collection at a university, that researchers there were looking into how shipworm worked in order to be able to protect these ships so that they can keep doing what they're doing, carrying their cargo, carrying their armies, carrying their guns. That story's already there. It's really, really obvious. Other interesting things.
Which museum was that, sorry?
This is the Grant Museum.
The Grant Museum. Shout out to the Grant Museum.
100%. It is the last surviving university natural history collection in London.
Keep funding university museums.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm not anti-museum at all, particularly the ones I used to work for. Because, some of them really are now starting to look at where their collections came from and ask these questions. In that exhibition, we talked about what are the stories that aren't there altogether, and we talked about slavery. There's not a single specimen in the Grant Museum, or really in any of the other museum collections, that we can link directly to the trade in enslaved African people. But the university was set up by people who made their money from the slave trade. It's part of the founding story of the university. And so the way that we dealt with that was we went with an empty case. These can be very naff. We were very mindful of the fact that they can be a pretty trite way of telling a story. But to us, this struck us as a good way of, the story is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. So having an empty case was a way of highlighting that fact that the story is always here.
So let's start thinking about some solutions, because you said you're hopeful for the future. So what are your hopes and fears for the future of truth-telling in museums?
We'll start with the fears first, and we're recording this very much in the immediate aftermath of a really monumental general election. If I sound vindictive about this, I don't mean to. But what became very clear, and it was clear to me to start with, was that those museums and large cultural organisations that were kowtowing to the Tories and essentially saying, you know what, we're neutral spaces, we're not political, come and host, your patrol money things in our spaces, and we'll take your blood money and we'll do all of these things and we'll shut up and we'll toe the line. The way that our political system works is that these people are never here the whole time. This is not to say we don't know how this current government is going to look at the culture war and how these stories are told in our cultural spaces. I am hopeful that they will take a better line about it. But the point I'm trying to make is that if we listen to politicians or if we listen to petty demagogues in charge, we continue to lie to ourselves about, first of all, our own agency in how we can actually go about telling these stories in ways that are helpful to everyone. So having talked about the negative, let's then focus on the positive. And what I would always want to do is to encourage my colleagues who work in museums to acknowledge the fact that, the people who walk through museum doors look to these organisations as places where they can learn about things, where they can be introduced to wider aspects of the world that they wouldn't encounter otherwise. And as curators and as front of house staff and as people who work in programming, the stories we tell are powerful, and we have a responsibility to tell them as honestly and as carefully as possible. We have a responsibility to those people who walk through the door. We should be ashamed if it's the case that people who walk through the door are traumatised by the things that they see, and we leave them to wallow in that trauma by themselves. It's our responsibility to take care of the people who walk through the doors.
So it seems like politics is still ingrained within the fabric of museums, and there's this sort of decolonial work that is happening. Is it possible for museums in the West to redeem their colonial past?
The answer to that question depends on the day of the week or the hour of the day that you ask that question.
Well, let me put it another way. You've seen there's lots of endeavours for decolonial work in museums. How far is that going, or is that all a lie?
I'm not going to call it a lie, because I know a lot of the people who are trying to do that work, and I don't doubt their intentions. I know what they are trying to do.
But if we put it into context with politics, where it's been put to the test.
Yeah, the problem with this is the people that I'm talking about by and large, I can probably name you a few exceptions, they're not at the top of the organisations. The way that our power structures work in museums, I mean, you only need to look at the fact that this is a predominantly female sector. It's mostly women that work in the heritage sector. But if you look at who the directors of large museums are, if you look at people who are in the top jobs, they tend to be men. It's definitely the case that the hierarchies and inequalities that exist within our society are reproduced tenfold in the context of the museum. And yeah, it's certainly the case that a lot of that leadership, by no means all of them, there's certainly a lot of people I can name who are trying to do things to change, but a lot of that leadership do kowtow to politicians. They do kowtow to a lowest common denominator in ways that I think are cowardly, and I quite frankly don't know how they sleep at night. But I think it's the case that the thing that I found most inspiring was what a guy called Clayton Muller said at Museums Association conference in 2019. He talked about how these large organisations, let's not think about them as if they are these giant cruise ships in the middle of the ocean that take forever to turn around. Let's think of them as schools of fish. Schools of fish in the ocean can be just as enormous as an ocean liner. But all it takes is for a few individuals to start to flit around in different directions, and the whole school can just change in one go. Can change direction, can change where it's going, can change what it's doing. So I am definitely of the opinion that change is possible. The decoloniality and decolonial approaches within the museum are possible. But in order for that to happen, I'm very mindful that existing structures of particularly race inequality, but also gender, disability, class, and body size, which is, these are the fundamental principles of eugenics that exist within our society. They're the ones that need to be broken down. So it's a very long-winded way, of saying I am optimistic, but I'm also realistic, again, in terms of how social inequality works. But I think if people in museums understand their agency and their power in terms of constructing stories in our society, not simply reflecting them, that's the thing that makes me hopeful for change in the future.
What advice would you give to cultural leaders to navigate ethical dilemmas about the restitution of looted objects?
Give them back. It's really not that complicated.
And what advice would you give the next generation of curators seeking to be better truth-tellers?
Be as unprofessional as you possibly can, which is a really difficult thing. I trained in museum studies. I've got a degree in museum studies. And I'm mindful that quite a lot of the things that I learned were professional, generally work to keep museums stuck exactly where they are. I would encourage, so be unprofessional in the sense of don't be conventional, be brave, remember to trust your instincts if you feel like they are being quashed, and understand that a museum is as much about the people who are in it as the objects who are in it. I always say treasure people, not things.
Treasure people, not things. But what does this look like in practice?
You will just see it in a curator that they know what the right thing is to do. If presented with the human remains in their collection that are completely lacking in provenance, or that they know the community that that person belongs to, they want to give them back. They don't want to hold on to somebody's ancestor. They don't want to hold on to somebody's family member. But the thing that I immediately see in them is, first of all, this instinctive sympathy with this group of people asking for repatriation. And then immediately it's like, oh, that's a lot of paperwork. Oh, that's a lot of legality, actually. How do we go about changing those sorts of things? Laws change. We're not stuck.
I love this idea of curators in the 21st century being increasingly more like facilitators of knowledge rather than the gatekeepers of knowledge.
Yeah, it's always that thing about, it's a curator means to take care. It's like, well, who are you taking care of? And if it's the case of what are you taking care of, why do you care about these 100-year-old dead and gone things compared to the people who are sat in the room with you? And why aren't you listening to what they're trying to tell you?
To hear more from Subhadra, listen to the bonus episode of the Museum of Truth and Lies, where we get to play a game of snakes and ladders with a twist. Okay, so let's roll the dice and then we can see... Oh my God, you've landed on a 4. So now I'm going to give you...
That's a ladder.
Number 4.
4 goes up to 14. So shall I go up or are we going to do forward?
You go up the ladder.
Yeah.
But then you've got to understand why you're going up the ladder. So this is the reason.
Okay. So the reason why I've gone up the ladder is, for 4, your community co-created exhibition wins an award. I'm going to dispute this.
Go on then.
Which award is it? And is it one of those awards where you have to buy the expensive ticket and go to the award ceremony in order to be even considered for whether you win it or not? And where is the money coming from? And that kind of thing.
So is it a win?
Is it a win though? No, it's just I've gone from 4 to 14. That is what has happened.
Thanks for visiting the Museum of Truth and Lies. Join me on the next gallery tour of this limited edition series from wherever you get your podcasts. You can find out about the making of this museum in the online Museum, an artist-illustrated magazine packed with playful tools and games, lovingly co-created with Sold Out Publishing. Tell us your thoughts and share your museum photos using the hashtag MuseumTruthLies.